Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for being here. I'm Irina Feygina, and I'd like to welcome you to this morning's series of panels and discussions that have come to be known collectively among us organizers as disasters, for many reasons. The goal of these sessions is to explore the complex interplay of governance and social forces in disaster response and long-term recovery. And it's also to take a critical look at the role that disasters play in our broader vision of resilience and adaptation, and to consider the benefits and perils of envisioning climate change as a series of disasters. So we're going to do this across two panels. And after presentations by our fabulous speakers, we have set aside additional time for discussion to explore these questions in greater depth and to hear from you. So as may be appropriate to disasters, our morning schedule has undergone some trials and tribulations, and I want to let you know of a small change in the lineup of the sessions. So unfortunately, Dr. Nancy Keat is not able to be with us. She fell ill. And so we're not going to have that session that was going to be just before lunch. But very luckily for us, we're going to have Rear Admiral David Titley join us as part of our second panel on disasters. So our schedule is going to stay basically the same, and our break is going to be at the same time, our lunch is going to be at the same time. But the second part of this is going to be a little bit different. We're going to have our first session on lessons on disasters, from disasters, then we're going to take a break, go into our second session, benefits and perils of disaster thinking, and then dive right into the discussion with all of the panels, both panel speakers, both from our first panel and our second panel. We'll give you a chance to reflect a little bit, talk to each other, and then share with us, etc. We'll give you all the details of that. And then lunch will be at the listed time. So if you think that several hours devoted to disasters is a dreadful proposition, which forebodes doom and gloom, think again. Aside from our wonderful speakers who are going to have really great stories, disasters also could offer opportunities and doorways. So to share a personal story, part of the reason why I organized this part of our summit. So although I've been involved in climate change work for about a decade, my personal relationship with climate change and interest in resilience in particular really crystallized last year as I climbed the unlit stairwells of 20 and 30-story public housing buildings in the Brooklyn shore of the Atlantic Ocean, carrying water, food, and basic necessities up to people who were unable to make their way out, checking to see if anyone requires medical assistance, and mapping out the need for help across the neighborhood. I was part of an effort that coalesced within the Russian Jewish community after Superstorm Sandy left our grandparents and many, many other residents of shoreline high-rises stranded without water, electricity, or a way to get out of the buildings. I saw a lot of destruction, a lot of chaos, and a lot of hardship. And I also saw a lot of collaboration and support that crossed social, racial, and political lines that are hard to permeate in ordinary times. And I saw amazing community organizing, most notably from Occupy Sandy, which I hope you'll hear a little bit about today. And I also saw many lessons that we must learn from disasters about the strengths and vulnerabilities in our governance systems, in our social structures, in our communities and organizations, and in ourselves. So I eagerly look forward to learning from our speakers today and the panels ahead. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our first panel, Lessons from Disasters. Our first presenter, we're just going to introduce all of you guys and then you can just take over. Our first presenter is Dr. Barbara Allen. She directs the Science, Technology, and Society program at Virginia Tech University. She researches and writes on the dynamics of disasters and recovery, on public understanding of science and environmental health movements and environmental knowledge and controversies. And she also teaches broadly courses on technology and social justice, the sociology of knowledge, the public participation, science, and technology. Dr. Allen has been closely following the long road to recovery after Hurricane Katrina, and today she'll share some of her insights from her work. Our second presenter is Nate Kleinman. He's an activist, organizer, organic farmer, and as he says, recovering politician. Nate has been actively involved in the recovery effort after Hurricane Sandy, as an Occupy Sandy organizer in New Jersey, as a member of the steering committee of the Cumberland County Long-Term Recovery Group, and as the founder of the Occupy Sandy New Jersey's weekly homelessness organizing calls focused on homeless encampments near the Jersey Shore. Nate's newest project is the Experimental Farm Network, a collectively run nonprofit enterprise aimed at developing climate change mitigating crops and sustainable agricultural systems using a network-based model. And our last and definitely not least speaker is Daniel Wallach. He's the executive director and founder of Greensburg, Greentown. Greensburg was mentioned yesterday in several of the panels, so you'll get to hear a lot more about it today. It's a nonprofit organization that conceptualized and helped lead the sustainable rebuilding of Greensburg, Kansas, following the tornado that wiped out the town in 2007. Daniel also opened the first affiliate Greentown organization in Joplin, Missouri, to help integrate sustainability into rebuilding that town after a major storm. Daniel is on a mission to pioneer sustainable disaster recovery, drawing on the interdependence between economic and environmental health. And of course, you can read more about our great speakers in your program. So you guys can go ahead, and then we'll hold the questions until the end for all the speakers. And I encourage you to speak right into the microphone, because apparently that really helps everyone here. Thanks so much, and welcome to our panel.
Do I speak from here, and how do I change the
Welcome.
slide?
Oh, Darshan. I think probably easier to come up if you're going to have some slides. Absolutely.
Gosh. Thank you.
Do you just want to start speaking a little bit?
Yeah, and you'll load the,
yep.
okay, great. Welcome, everybody, and I'm pleased to be here, and I'm pleased to see such a full audience, actually, for this auditorium. I've spent many hours in this auditorium in the past. I'm going to speak about post-disaster rebuilding. And I'm going to do it, I'm from the New Orleans area, and after Katrina, I began a research project that took about 7 or 8 years before I began writing this up. So I went year after year, many times a year. I got to know people, I got to know neighborhoods. So this research comes out of sort of deep ethnographic field work in trying to figure out what worked. So unlike a lot of scholars that rushed in, wrote some things, rushed out, and you know, the publication industry around Katrina is huge, I spent years and watched it at a very molecular level. And I had some very surprising findings. Okay. And to move forward, I do this. Okay. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about Katrina generically. I'm actually not going to name names or name neighborhoods, but I'm going to talk about some paradigmatic case studies and what I consider to be not actually significant factors, but the significant factor in what determining success of NGO and help group assistance. There was one factor that stood out for all the money that poured in that led to successful rebuilding and repatriation years later. And not just any old rebuilding, but green and sustainable rebuilding. First, I just want to say something briefly. I'm shameless, but I run a PhD program, a night program for working adults in Falls Church, which is the Northern Virginia area. And for those of you that don't know, Virginia Tech has a huge presence here. It's a big secret, unfortunately. But we have large programs in urban planning and public affairs and government and international affairs. 1/3 of all the graduate students of Virginia Tech are actually here in the Northern Virginia area, and we have 4 different campuses. So if you're interested, I have a flyer for my program after the talk. So what were the strategies and practices of the most successful NGOs and nonprofits and help groups? What kinds of things did they do that years out we actually saw a huge difference in the various neighborhoods? Having spent 7 years observing these neighborhoods, interviewing people, and prior to 2000, I was actually an architecture professor. I taught in Louisiana. I actually taught historic preservation at Tulane. So I know these neighborhoods intricately even beforehand. So I had a sort of special insider's view, if you will. So I chose a set of neighborhoods for my NSF-funded research, and I followed them year after year. And all these neighborhoods shared some things in common. They were all heavily flooded, heavily damaged. They were all low income by average. They were all majority-minority neighborhoods. So in that sense, I sort of held that stable. The amount of money and resources that poured in from help groups, from NGOs, was huge. But the money spent was not the factor that was the determinant of success. So I started thinking a little bit more about this idea of environmental justice, because you could actually classify these neighborhoods as environmental justice communities. A lot of thought has been put into, and a lot of scholarship has been written on the term environmental and environmental justice. What is the environment? The environment's not just, eagles and the mountains, but it's also the urban environment, it's the water, it's the daily lives of people, the economics of people, the schools of people. So the term environment has been highly problematized in the environmental justice arena, but the term justice has not. So I started thinking a little bit about this term justice, and what exactly does it mean, and what core justice idea was at the heart of all of these NGOs and nonprofits' assistance strategies? Because they all had a core justice concept at their heart, but many of them left it implicit rather than explicit. And after all the years of observation, I would say that the one most important determinant factor of the success of NGOs and help groups and agencies was the concept of justice at the heart of their strategy and practice, period. So what am I saying here? What is justice? If all of you think in the audience what it is, you think, oh, it's being fair. If we go back to the great political theorist John Rawls 50 years ago, his idea of justice as fairness, justice as distribution. You get a bunch of stuff, and that stuff could be clean air or jobs or environmental goods, green rebuilding materials, and you distribute them fairly, and you have a fair system to do this. But actually, over the last 50 years, there's been a lot of work by scholars and others highlighting what's missing in this idea. And let me just say that all of the groups that poured into New Orleans post-Katrina all wanted to do good. They all wanted to help, and they all wanted to do so responsibly. But they had different implicit or explicit ideas of what was just and what was fair at the heart of their regime. And this, in the end, made all the difference. So I'm going to put on my college professor hat for just a minute. I can't help myself. And I just want to give you a little quick, fast lesson on justice, because I'm going to talk about these ideas as they look on the ground in just a minute. So the famous John Rawls, the Harvard scholar, 50 years ago, or 1970 to be precise, wrote his book, A Theory of Justice. And his idea was sort of counter the utilitarian justice. In other words, a lot of public policy in America was utilitarian. You do the thing that's best for the majority of people, and those people that kind of are left out of the loop, too bad. And he tried to think of a way to be more fair. And so his idea of let's distribute things fairly, and I put it in terms of rebuilding, so let's distribute rebuilding goods fairly. And procedurally, which he also wrote on, let's have mechanisms for that redistribution or distribution. But since that time, there's a number of scholars, and I just put some names in parentheses, but there's a number of different ways to look at justice that have built on or have veered off from Rawls's idea of justice. And I'm going to talk about these, but let me just briefly mention them. First of all is the cultural justice, or recognition-based justice. This is addressing the social context of unequal distribution. What is that context? And who are those people that have not been recognized, who are not seen in this redistribution scheme? And then there's representative justice, looking at participatory parity in rebuilding decision-making and other schemes, how they can be equal partners in social interaction with a focus on inclusion. And this equal partners thing is very important. And then lastly, a kind of different thread of justice comes from the work of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, which is called capabilities justice. And of course, he won the Nobel Prize, 10, 15 years ago for this idea. But it's the degree, I think is book might have been called Justice as Freedom. And it's the degree to which resources of rebuilding are transformed into fully lived lives of the residents as the residents envision them. So enough of the lesson. Now let's go back to the actual case studies. So I'm calling it Neighborhood A. I chose two of my neighborhoods, and I picked neighborhoods at the opposite spectrum from each other. And Neighborhood A was heavily flooded, and after Katrina, a number of universities and philanthropy organizations, environmental groups came together, and they sort of thought this neighborhood would be great to target with green rebuilding and make it a key study for how green building can happen in low-income and minority communities. This group got together, and eventually they included the neighborhood, and they said, we'd like to come in and be part of greening your neighborhood. Now, the neighborhood had never actually asked to be green or wanted to be rebuilt green, but hey, these people were here to help and to help rebuild, so they weren't against it. The neighborhood actually created a neighborhood association through which all the green resources could be filtered. Almost 100 green groups over the period of these years have filtered in and put in things from solar collectors, radiant heat barriers, bamboo flooring, community garden organizers, bike lanes, low water toilets. They even had a demonstration center on how you make your house green and sustainable. And then, of course, there was the original green builders, which were the historic preservationists, recycle your home, and this is the biggest green idea. They brought in labor to do this and to help them, and they sought, in a Rawlsian sense, they distributed all their green stuff, they distributed all their green labor, and they did it through a mechanism, the community group, that ensured that it was sort of equally spread out. But years later, this neighborhood is still struggling. Their hand is out. They're looking for more stuff. And I would say that it's not a unsuccessful story, but it's certainly not a success story in any sense of the word. So simply distributing a bunch of green stuff and doing it fairly is not enough. So let's turn and look at Neighborhood B. Neighborhood B was approached by an elite nonprofit who was an umbrella for a couple of other nonprofits, and these were sort of university-affiliated people, and I'm not naming any of this. And they were approached, again, a heavily flooded, actually more flooded neighborhood than the first one. And this nonprofit came to town and said, do you want to work with us? And the community was a heavily divided community. On one side of the tracks, if you will, was a predominantly African American, very poor, and a lot of rental property. On the other side of the tracks was a middle-class white neighborhood with better housing, more raised a little bit higher, and better built housing. And then in a third section of the neighborhood was a kind of commercial district, car mechanics and stores and shops and that kind of thing. And they were very bifurcated, not just by race, but also by the geography of the neighborhood. So the nonprofit came to town, and when the neighborhood agreed to work with them, the nonprofit said, we have two rules. Rule number one is, we're not going to tell you what to do. You have to figure that out. And rule number two is, we're not going to give you one penny, so don't even ask. There's no money that we're going to give you. So what the neighborhood ended up doing is they had to figure out what they were going to do to rebuild. I mean, they were heavily damaged. So counterintuitively, the neighborhood divided into three groups. And one group was the predominantly African American neighborhood. The other group was the predominantly white, wealthier neighborhood, part of the neighborhood. And then the third group was the commercial district. And they got together in these separate groups, and they began to talk about things like, what did they want for their transportation and safety? What kinds of things were they going to propose for schools, for healthcare? What about some kind of cultural aspect for the neighborhood? What about green space? So all of these topics were talked about and discussed, and decisions were made in the individual groups. Now, Post-Katrina New Orleans was a city in which the only people that could come back were the people that were wealthy enough to put rebuilding on their charge card, because it took a lot of money to rebuild your house. So in the city at the time, the only people that were back in this neighborhood were the wealthier white residents. So if they would have met together as a group, then the only voices that would have been heard from the entire neighborhood would have been from the wealthier white residents. Because the neighborhood was bifurcated in this way, you had the African American group, who a lot of them were renters, a lot of them living in Houston and Atlanta, were piped in via phone link and other ways in which the poorer community could talk about what they wanted to see in their neighborhood and not just be drowned out by the wealthier white residents. So this, in justice terms, it sought to recognize the people that were not in the city because they couldn't afford to be in the city at that time. It also sought to recognize renters, which were heavily misrecognized by government programs that only privileged owners of houses rather than people that owned rental housing. So it sought to recognize a lot of groups that would have been misrecognized and not seen in an inclusive manner had the group just been a whole. So, and there's a lot of interesting things that came from this. So once they talked amongst themselves, they would come together once a month and negotiate and reach a consensus. And they always reached a consensus. And they came up with very strong plans that were endogenous and inherent to the neighborhood. So then what happened, once they had their ideas, the nonprofit group, the elite nonprofit, would act as researchers to figure out what kinds of things might happen. So for example, they were going to have a charter school. So the nonprofit researched charter schools and figured out who all the companies were, what all their standing was, and presented this to the community, and they could pick which charter schools they wanted and write this up. And the same thing with transportation corridors, the same things with green space. The elite nonprofits served as the research base. They also served as a translator to help translate the ideas of the community into nonprofit speak. In other words, so that the various foundations that were giving out money would fund them. And many of their proposals for a green school, a green library, a cultural corridor, and now a health center has all been funded by outside organizations because they were taught how to make their idea, take their own internal ideas and turn them into fundable concepts. And I was thinking about what Harriet Tregoning was saying, is there's this money available for seed money and for development, but you have to be the number one competitor. You have to be able to put your ideas into sort of fundable language or funding speak. So I guess. Oh, and the neighborhood B has come back stronger than before. They've actually become a tax district. They voted to become a tax district, so now they actually have elected officials that run the neighborhood. They have a tax base that now contributes to moving these ideas forward and to keeping, for example, the health center is still not done, but it's about 50% there. And they can still move their neighborhood better forward, and it's even better and stronger than before. And ironically, even though they didn't start out with a green idea at their base, what they ended up getting was a very sustainable, green, rebuilt neighborhood, in large part because of the kind of funding available. So how I would like to conclude is that what is meant by just assistance really matters. It's time to leave old paradigms of redistribution and simply handing things out equally behind, and think about ideas such as participatory parity, recognition, and capabilities. Exogenous ideas that are imposed on communities from the outside often don't work. They'll take the resources and they'll use them, but the seed of greenness and sustainability doesn't really grow. Endogenous ideas that come from the community, and their own issues can lead naturally to green and sustainable solutions. But it can't be from a sort of fear-based finger-wagging like apocalyptic threats of the big flood, or this is good for you and it'll be better for you if you do this. The parental approach that doesn't work. I think it's time that we talk to communities, find out what they want, and from that, let the seeds of sustainability grow. Thank you.
I'll do mine from here. So my name's Nate Kleinman. I'm from Philadelphia, and I got involved in this disaster world quite unexpectedly. It's not something I ever really planned. I was involved in the Occupy movement in Philadelphia soon after it started, and early on, I met some folks from New York who were interested in building communication networks between different encampments, and the Occupy movement was very new at this point and very exciting, and we didn't know where it was headed or what we could accomplish, but we knew that by getting together and communicating with each other, we might be able to achieve something more. And so we started having conference calls, and we very fortuitously started using the Maestro conference system. I don't work for Maestro, but I'm going to plug them anyway. It's a great tool that allows, you can actually type on your phone, and it will show up on the moderator's screen. If you press 1 to raise your hand, you can press 2 if you like what someone said, 3 if you didn't like what they said, 4 if you want to respond directly. And using this system, we could have 100 people on a conference call and actually still be productive and still make decisions. So after Sandy hit, a number of folks with Occupy Wall Street in New York started mobilizing and driving out to the more marginalized communities, just seeing what was needed. And they partnered with community groups, with churches, and started delivering services to people who were very much in need, going up high rises to bring people meals and water, facilitating the distribution of all kinds of goods, and managing volunteers, which turned out to be one of the most important things that we did, because there weren't. It was very hard for people who wanted to help out, who lived in the area but who didn't suffer damage themselves, to actually volunteer. You couldn't do it with the Red Cross. You couldn't do it with the Salvation Army unless you were already on their list. So Occupy Sandy mobilized thousands of people in New York, and because I had been involved in Inter-Occupy, this communications group, a few days after the storm, some of my friends in New York said, "Hey, you're in Philly. Would you have a conference call for New Jersey? We got our hands full here in New York." So about a week after the storm, we had our first conference call. We had 80 people on the call from all over New Jersey, and from actually even from other countries, people who wanted to help out. And from then, we had these calls every night at 9 o'clock. We, using the kind of principles of horizontality and consensus-based decision-making that most Occupy groups followed, we organized a collective in New Jersey that developed very rapidly into an organization that was helping people all up and down the coast of New Jersey, especially in the most marginalized communities where people were not getting help from FEMA or from the Red Cross. There just wasn't enough services. And people think of New Jersey as a small state, but it actually takes about, even with no traffic, it takes about 3.5 hours to drive from the place in the south where there was damage to the places in the north where there was damage. And it's a wide stretch like that. Dozens and dozens of communities were just wiped off the map, and in mobile home communities and in rural communities, people were absolutely floored, and they haven't gotten resources, the kind of resources that they need. So I wanted to talk a little bit, and I'm sorry, I am a farmer now, and I live in a place where I have no internet and no power except the solar panel that charges fuels our pump to irrigate the fields, so I have, this is my presentation. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the official response versus the unofficial response as I've come to see it. The official response is the government response, FEMA, and then the Red Cross works with them and is typically the most visible aspect of the official response after disaster. I had never, like I said, I had never been involved in a disaster before. But I got involved over the next year in lots of Occupy Sandy work, but I came to get involved as well in the official response. And as you'll see, my affiliation in the program is listed as the Cumberland County Long-Term Recovery Group. I wonder how many folks have heard of VOAD? All right, a few hands out there. So VOAD it stands for Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. And it's an organization that's been around for a few decades, and they essentially work to coordinate organizations that work in post-disaster communities. And the VOAD organization, the National VOAD organization, has lots of guidelines, and basically they come in and advise local communities on how to set up a grassroots committee to coordinate disaster relief. And these are called variously called long-term recovery groups or long-term recovery organizations. Sometimes it's called a local VOAD. They have different names for them. But essentially, it's a volunteer-run committee that kind of takes over responsibility for a community's recovery process after the initial first responders leave, which happens much more quickly than you might expect. In some of the hardest hit communities in New Jersey, I talked to people who said, yeah, there was a Red Cross shelter for a few weeks, and we saw a couple FEMA trucks driving around, but that was it. And so after that, it falls to the local communities to coordinate recovery. And as Dr. Allen was saying, a lot of a major part of the value that these groups add is they help to, VOAD and the national partners help to translate into nonprofit speak, into foundation speak, to raise money. And so I found myself in spending some time in South Jersey because it's close to Philadelphia. I did a lot of work in North Jersey as well, in the trailer park manufactured housing communities up in Moonachie, and then some of the Raritan Bayshore communities south of Staten Island, Union Beach, Greensburg. These were places that were already economically struggling before the storm hit, and they're just rather miserable now. I think that's fair to say. But I started working about 6 months after the storm in a place called Cumberland County, which is on the Delaware Bay shore in South Jersey. Most people don't realize that the Delaware Bay shore was even hit by Sandy, and the way the demographics work in Cumberland, most of the people live inland, and they were not hit as hard as the people on the coast. Cumberland County has about 45 miles of coastline along the Delaware Bay, and a rich history of oyster harvesting and fishing, crabbing, and only about 3 miles of those 45 miles are inhabited. So it's mostly marshland, lots of wildlife preserves, and I found out from going to actually a national VOAD meeting in Elizabeth, New Jersey, that there was a local long-term recovery group in Cumberland County, and I hadn't heard about this, so I found out when the meetings were, and I went. In New Jersey, the state declared that there were 9 counties that were the hardest hit counties, and that's based on a FEMA guideline that says I think 1.5% of at least 1.5% of the tax base had to have suffered significant damage. But because of the demographics, with 100,000 odd people living in the northern part of the county and a few thousand living by the coast, they didn't fit this threshold. So Cumberland, Salem, Gloucester, a number of counties did not qualify as one of the hardest hit communities. So the folks who live in those communities were ineligible for all of the state-administered federal programs, federal aid programs. So all the CDBG funds, all of the funds for rebuilding people's houses, for elevating houses, were inaccessible to people who lived in these communities. So I started going to these meetings, and I found incredibly dedicated, diligent volunteers who had just been left behind, absolutely left behind by the official recovery process. And they had meetings once a month, and so it was easy for me to get down to them, but they were quite short-handed, and within a few weeks, within a few months, I had volunteered to chair the PR subcommittee, which they hadn't had, and nobody knew what was happening down in Cumberland. And so very quickly, we, after some time, we started raising the profile of the county, speaking to media outlets in the rest of the state, going to conferences and things, and making people realize that this place was hit hard as well and needed some help. But it's important. I wanted to talk about this group mainly because I think the lessons from the long-term recovery groups are that the greatest change that I've seen anyway it comes from these grassroots organizations. It comes from the communities themselves, and they need help. They absolutely need all kinds of assistance. But if there are not local communities getting involved and people absolutely dedicated to this, nothing is going to happen. And in Cumberland, I would give most credit to the chair of the organization, who's a woman by the name of Megan Wren, who also is the executive director of the largest nonprofit in the area, and has an incredibly full plate. She actually swam across the Delaware Bay last summer in order to raise awareness of the situation, followed English Channel rules, and I don't think anybody had ever done that before. It was 13 miles. But somebody who is professional and understands how things work, like Megan, has been able to get much more for Cumberland than anybody could have expected. They started a process with FEMA to develop proposals for funding major projects that have been sitting around for decades in Cumberland. Some of the areas they built berms 200 years ago that were wiped away by Sandy, earthen berms, and there was no money to repair these. It's an area that, due to climate change, due to sea level rise, and also I think it's called glacial subduction or something, the land is actually sinking as sea level is rising in South Jersey. So they are, a lot of the official policymakers in the state seem to have given up on this part of New Jersey, that the communities on the Bay Shore will not survive the century, so we shouldn't throw good money after bad. And it's that's a real challenge. I'm going to shift a little bit, I think that one of the critical things, I liked what you said about innovation. I think that's it's really important that people are that we're thinking all kinds of different ways to approach climate change and approach resiliency. The project that I'm involved in now that you mentioned a little bit in the program is it's called the Experimental Farm Network, and it's something that I wouldn't have been able to get off the ground without help from folks in Occupy Sandy. And the idea is to use this network model to develop climate change mitigating crops. If you don't know much about agriculture at all, you probably know that you plant a seed, it grows, you harvest it, and then you do the same thing again next year. That's our typical agricultural system with crops like wheat and corn and our basic staple crops, cotton. But then the inputs that are required to grow crops like that are immense. The energy required to till the fields year after year, the fertilizers, the pesticides for folks who use that kind of stuff. It's way too much. And As a driver of carbon emissions, of climate change, agriculture, it plays a hugely outsized role, and it doesn't. It's not one that gets talked about much because we're talking about transportation, or we're talking about energy and things like that. But agriculture is huge. So we're trying to develop perennial crops, perennial grains. There's been a lot of work over the last 100 years, but mostly it's been done in isolation, small groups doing it. And so by applying a network model, we hope to actually be able to use the technology that's available now, the USDA database system. You can request an unbelievable amount of genetic material from the USDA. They will send you seeds and cuttings for free, as long as you have legitimate research, educational, or breeding purposes with it. But that's, that searchable database didn't exist 20 years ago, when people were already doing great work like this. But with plant breeding, if you're crossing things, the more times that you get, the more times that you attempt a cross, the more chances you're going to have a beneficial mutation and actually create something valuable. So that's what I'm up to right now, and to me it's so related to the social justice work that I've been doing for the last few years, because as I've seen firsthand, a storm like Sandy, it hit already marginalized communities the hardest, and throughout the recovery process, because of various structural inequalities, those are the communities that continue to be left behind. In New Jersey, people who lived in manufactured housing communities, they thought that they were ineligible for aid because it said online, that trailers are not eligible. And so they thought, well, I live in a trailer, so I guess I'm not eligible. And in one community where 400 houses 400 trailers were damaged, only 4 people applied and got the main aid money in the first few months, which was absolutely outrageous. And so it's. I think I'll leave it there. I know I have a few more minutes left, but I'll be happy when we get to the discussion. This is ongoing work that. Even though I consider myself a full-time farmer at this point, I'm headed to Cumberland County tomorrow to man the Cumberland LTRG's table at Bay Day, Delaware Bay Day, which is the big annual event. And I expect to be involved in this fight for the rest of my life, because we're going to be fighting the corporations and lots of folks who would rather put their heads in the sand and ignore the realities of climate change. Thanks very much.
Hello. Such important work everybody here is doing. What Michael Dorsey said this morning that resonated with me most is that we need inspiration more than anything, and to move this agenda forward. When I talk about agenda, it's really survival is the agenda. It's that basic, and I think we need much more passion injected into what we are doing in order to move people at the rate we need to move people. And hopefully the story of Greensburg will inspire you. It certainly happened. It was the first major disaster after Katrina, and the Bush administration was not going to get this one wrong. And in Kansas, where this happened, Kathleen Sebelius was governor at the time. So it was the perfect storm politically. There was a lot of political tension there and competition, and it was very good for Greensburg. The These are just some shots from my backyard. I live in the middle of nowhere, about 35 miles northeast of Greensburg. And my wife and I, at the time, my wife and I are now divorced, but very friendly. She's working in Joplin, and I stayed behind just outside of Greensburg. Gorgeous area. The only thing it really lacks is water, which is not insignificant, but it's quite beautiful. She and I met in Denver, started the Colorado Association of Nonprofit Organizations, did that for a while, completely burned out, got very ill, and spent about a decade convalescing and studying the healing arts, and filed medical bankruptcy and moved to Kansas from Denver, rural Kansas. Very different from where I grew up, and very different politically, especially. This is actually the path of the tornado the night it happened, but you can see where it says St. John. Here's Greensburg here, 2 up is St. John. That's where I live. The tornado went right by us. We were very fortunate, but our friends in Greensburg were not. Talk a little bit about Greensburg. About 100 miles west of Wichita, 50 miles from the Oklahoma border, right in the heart of Tornado Alley. Pre-tornado population about 1,400. Town was established in 1886. Of course, you've probably all heard of it before because it is the home of the world's largest hand-dug well. And I'm sure if you didn't visit, you studied it in school. These are pictures of the early days. It was actually Greensburg. Everybody thought we changed the name to Greensburg to capitalize on the Green Initiative. No, it was actually named for Cannonball Green. He was a stagecoach driver. This was Greensburg just pre-tornado. Really typical rural Kansas town, really rural American town. A variety of architecture. There had been one building permit issued in the previous 10 years prior to the tornado. But really a lot of nice architecture. And then May 4th, 2007, 9:45, my wife and I, we were in our storm bunker. We'd actually dined the night before with a guy whose uncle lived in Greensburg, and he called us 15 minutes before, right after the storm hit Greensburg and before it hit us, and said, "Don't mess around with this one. My uncle lost the farm. They're okay, but they lost everything." Well, this is the monster that hit that night. Average tornado, 75 yards wide. This tornado, 1.7 miles wide. Gives you a little bit of an idea of the monstrosity that it was. That's the path of the tornado up there. Winds exceeding 200 miles an hour. Again, I'm not, pictures like this are just commonplace anymore. Soon after it happened, it really caught the attention of the country. Early days of Google Earth and satellite imagery, this is, a lot of people were introduced to it, seeing the before and after shots of Greensburg. You can see it looks like a vacuum cleaner went over it. About 2 square miles, and again, the tornado was 1.7 miles. It literally dropped the beginning of town and it lifted at the end of town. This is the tent, the FEMA tent that was set up. Now, my wife and I had done a natural foods co-op, and that's how we knew families in Greensburg. Nobody was allowed in Greensburg other than the folks who lived there. Nobody who lived there was allowed to be there the week after the tornado. About 95% of the community was wiped out. There's just nothing. So nobody had any idea how many people of those 1,400 were even going to come back for a meeting, which was exactly a week after the tornado, and that's what this is. Because of our friends in Greensburg, we got in, I developed a concept paper on rebuilding Greensburg as a model green community. This was a very exciting concept to me. I was very familiar with the political climate there, and I knew that was going to be a tough sell. But when we got to town with the concept paper, found that Sebelius' office also had the idea to rebuild Green, and a couple others, including, most importantly, the original mayor at that time. There was the long-term recovery process where folks were brought in and encouraged to give their feedback on the rebuilding of the community. Hey, get back there. Oh, stop it. Well, you don't need to read all this, but just understand that it was truly a community-wide effort, plus a lot of generosity from outside the community coming in. And as I mentioned earlier, the Bush administration and the federal government were all ears, and they came in and did whatever was needed to do this recovery. These are pictures today, what Greensburg looks like. It has been, by many measures, a great success. This is one of my favorite pictures because you see the wind turbines on the horizon. Now, this was a very oil, gas, coal-dependent state that had no interest in anything outside of that. But it's got the third highest wind resources in the country, outside of Texas and Oklahoma. And so while the community was poised to come back with coal, we made a very hard sell that if you were going to do this as a model green community, coal wasn't going to cut it as a power source. So we were, the community rallied and said, yeah, why wouldn't we use wind in the recovery? So they did. Our organization, Greensburg Greentown, really pushed for ecotourism from day one, that if this community could rebuild as a model green community, we would get attention and tourists from around the country. To our amazement, we've had tourists from around the world, and we continue to in Greensburg. And if you come, this is a map of all the sites, sustainable sites in town, which are tourable. That's the hospital. You can see the old hospital up in the corner. This is the new hospital to the left. It is a gorgeous facility, a little bit of an overkill for a town of now fewer than 1,000. But it's a 15-bed, $30 million hospital, the first LEED Platinum critical care facility in the country. I'm not going to go through in depth all these slides, but if you look at the bar graph upper right, basically all you need to know is if they had built to standard energy code, that would be their annual cost there on the left. The way they did build to LEED standards, their costs are significantly less. And the purple that goes below the graph is to show the renewable energy on site. BTI John Deere, anybody who's familiar with rural America knows that John Deere is a cultural icon. I, as a lifelong environmentalist, was very concerned that they, being the largest employer in Greensburg, was going to get in our way, that they'd be very threatened, but they weren't at all. It was quite the opposite. And in fact, today, this family-owned dealership of John Deere now runs a wind turbine sales and service company in 38 states. So they've linked with other John Deere facilities around the country. And this all came because of what happened in Greensburg. They'd had no interest in this prior to, but they were a great community citizen and really the reason, one of the main reasons the Green Initiative flourished. They actually brought the John Deere corporate into sustainability in a way that John Deere corporate had never entertained. But they are much more committed as a global corporation to sustainability today because of what happened in Little Greensburg. City Hall, built from the remains of the power station that had been destroyed. That's all the brick is from there. Has a water collection system that's tied to Main Street. Again, you can see in the bar graph, significant cost savings. Really beautiful $50 million school. They consolidated all the schools in the county to now go to this school. It's a wonderful learning environment. It needs very little artificial light. It's almost all day lit. Really a sight to see. And if you ever get out this way, you'll want to see the school. And again, all these sites are tourable, and it's been an amazing participation of the community to make this living laboratory very visitable and educable to folks from outside the community. Courthouse achieved LEED Gold. This was one of 2 buildings that survived, and they rehabbed it and put a geothermal heating and cooling system in there. As you can see, about 40% annual savings on energy costs for them. We found that while a number of folks did very sustainable residential redesign, we couldn't ask folks to open their homes to tourists on an ongoing basis, so we developed this concept called the chain of eco-homes. The first one was built for us by a company out of Florida that designed this concrete round structure, which we now is a bed and breakfast. You can come stay there. It's where our offices are in the Green Visitor Center. This picture, you can see where the builder wanted to show how durable these concrete homes were. So he took a crane and took this Ford Fiesta, lifted it 60 feet above the building, and dropped it twice, which was not easy on me. I really didn't think it would hold up to that, but it did. And it was a great publicity stunt. It got a lot of coverage. This is the second home going up across the street, a wood block system out of Europe, really good system. It's wood, but it is built to withstand 220 mile an hour plus winds. I mentioned the wind farm generates way more than the community, way more power than the community can ever use. And so it is now a net exporter of power. And that, to me, is one of the great success stories. I don't know if anybody saw on MSNBC about a week and a half ago, there was a story on the Koch brothers. And they are out of Wichita, and they rule Kansas in a lot of ways. But one of their pet projects is to rescind the renewable portfolio standard, which Sebelius' office put in place. And they have not been able to do it. It's been defeated 3 times, and it's a very, very Koch loyal legislature in Kansas and Governor Brownback. But they can't get it done because wind has been established in Kansas, and Greensburg has been a really big part of that. So the question I get all the time, and I've probably done this presentation about 100 times, is how did this extremely conservative, isolated, economically depressed rural community come to embrace this radical green initiative? And it was simple, and it is simple, and it is self-interest. And I come back to the inspiration point. We, from day one, were very clear that if this initiative was not authentic to the people in the town, it wasn't going to have legs. And so from day one, use my organizing background to just talk with people. And we spent 2 months talking to anybody who would talk to us about this initiative and hearing their perspectives and perceptions of it. And the question I got 99 times out of 100 was, you're a tree hugger, aren't you? And I was like, no, I'm not a tree hugger, and I'm certainly not an environmentalist. But I do care a lot about survival, and I care about my family, and I care about creation. And that is what I talked about. And the languaging that I used with these folks was helping them understand this was about their future, their kids' future, and that their ancestors were the original sustainability advocates, right? They built with solar orientation, they built very energy efficient structures. They're conservatives, they conserve, they do not like waste. And so we simply framed what we were going to do here aligned with their values. And what I say every day is there's nobody who doesn't have primary self-interest in the well-being of the natural environment. Why is this so hard for us to understand and communicate? It's crazy. And we've been able to show in tiny Greensburg, Kansas, where it's a very politically conservative community, how to frame this discussion in a way that they can relate to it. And again, don't have to go into these in detail, but conservative values and sustainability values are virtually identical. And with that, I think I will wrap it up and look forward to hearing questions from the audience.
Thank you all so much. If you guys have questions, come on up to the microphones in the aisles.
Hello, I'm Kristen Honey, a AAAS fellow, and I'm placed at Department of Energy right now. I want to thank you all for great talks, and I thought, Daniel, you were a perfect example of leadership from within that we heard from Barbara and Nate is so important. And my question is primarily for Daniel, but I'd be curious in all your perspectives. How do you think the model that you use to rebuild is scalable? Like a community of 1,400 that is arguably, obviously small, but similar, how could that scale to a much larger community, a city with diverse interests, diverse communities, or will it scale?
Yeah, I mean, it again comes back to self-interest and relating all of this to the self-interest of the folks that we're dealing with. Now, my specialty at this point is in disaster recovery. And I must say I'm extremely frustrated because it's a very difficult realm to get traction in. FEMA is very dominant in the space, and while the federal government has been progressive in some ways, there are pieces of it. You talk about being replicable. We've developed a handbook for sustainable disaster recovery. It's crazy that people are rebuilding structures the same as the ones that were lost in terms of energy usage, in terms of durability, in terms of resilience. We can't get people to rebuild, and it's just so common sense. And what I would like to see more than anything, and I don't want to pick on Habitat for Humanity. I think what they do in some areas, they do extremely good work. But giving $100,000 to a family to come into a rebuilt home is, in my mind, not a very good investment when you have an alternative of creating an incentive program for people, say, to get a more energy efficient heating and cooling system and giving incentives to those folks. Because when you do that and their utility bills are half what they were prior to the storm, you're making a really big impact on a community perpetually. So is it replicable? Absolutely, but it's about getting people tools. And we partnered with the Department of Energy, National Renewable Energy Labs. I was actually on contract with them, our organization was. They did extremely good work and very efficiently. And that work was all about getting people information. And one of the basic tenets was build with 2x6 wood if you're going to build back wood instead of 2x4. You have a 50% more insulating capacity, and it's a much more durable home. And it's nominally more expensive. It's crazy to be building with 2x4 wood. It's of another era. So those kinds of things, it's getting people information and giving people, in my experience, even small incentives to stop doing, I think Harriet mentioned it this morning, that when people are coming back from disaster, they're kind of numbed out and they just want to get back to the way things were. And what we've found is people just need a little tiny bit of hand-holding to change the entire trajectory of their rebuild.
I was just going to say real quick that I think that we need to start seeing economic inequality, structural inequalities, how that manifests itself in health, in education, in food sovereignty, in the basic lack of opportunity that so many people in this country have. We have to start seeing that as a disaster, and I think it's a fundamental change in the way people think. It involves looking at driving through a poor neighborhood and not just shaking your head and driving a little faster and locking your car doors, but seeing those people as survivors, as victims of the disaster of, I would frame it as unrestrained global capitalism, but you may do it in some other way.
Well, I guess, I would have a question about the replicability of the model of your town, in part because of what I saw in Katrina. The most green, quote-unquote, neighborhood with the most amount of green resources and solar panels, and yes, the heating bills are lower and the air conditioning bills are lower because of this, but it didn't actually it didn't create the kind of and they were hoping to have ecotourism, and I think they have a little bit, but it wasn't the success of the other community in which the ideas for what their community would be like was internal to that community and came from that community. Simply moving in as a bunch of green groups and enrolling people in your project to become their project, I'm not sure that's the most successful model from my own research, at least. Mm-hmm.
Just in response to that, I would say, I think in some ways we're saying the same thing. When you talk about native and authentic to the community, absolutely essential. And what happened in Greensburg was authentic and is authentic to those people. These are people who are, again, a town of 1,400, they had 9 churches, and they rebuilt 8. For 800. This is a very religious community that considers themselves very spiritual. Stewardship is something that resonates with them. And so I don't think you can do it if you don't align with people's personal values. I don't know how else we're going to do it, really.
Yes, I'm Tal Day, and I'm with the Committee on Stewardship of Creation of the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia, so that gives me a nice segue. Yeah. And the question specifically directed to David Wallach, but I think that Barbara Allen has touched on the question I'm going to raise as well. That I understand, from all I understand in that part of Kansas, that farming families live in communities and then drive out to where their fields are. And you mentioned the growth of one new industry, namely the wind farm service industry that was being developed by the deer dealer. You mentioned ecotourism, but what happened to agriculture? Did it continue to consolidate? Did the farm families who had been in Greensburg move elsewhere, continue to farm the same fields, or was this disaster a factor leading to more consolidation of farming in the area?
I mean, I would respond first and foremost by saying farming is one of the biggest disasters in this country, and I'm sure Nate can talk much more eloquently about that, but I live in the heart of it, and it's crazy what's happened with the industrialization of farming. I mean, there are very few people employed by it anymore. I mean, you know, not that long ago, there was a home in every quarter, every 160 acres, and that was the scale in the community. The average farm size now out there is about 10,000 acres. You can't have very many families living in a community when you've got one owner per 10,000 acres. It's just, we did not choose to go after farming. We knew that was a battle we didn't want to pick. So not a lot has been done there. The local dealership has talked about organic farming, but it's a paradigm that is very difficult to shift from.
Maybe let's take one more question, and then I know there are more questions in the audience, and we're going to have an opportunity to raise all these questions in our discussion, so please hold on to them. Just want to make sure you guys have a break, but then we'll have more time to talk and for questions and such.
Great, thank you. Teo Grossman from Bioneers. A lot of this conversation has been about, and maybe by design, rebuilding post-disaster and what sort of resilient rebuild looks like. You could argue that if you're talking about resilience to climate change, getting out in front of this is a big part of it. So, you know, avoiding the need to rebuild in the first place. And I'm particularly curious about. It's kind of a tough question, but there might be places where either it's not worth rebuilding, or we should leave in the first place. So you're getting concepts like managed retreat being a big popular, maybe not popular, but it's definitely happening in places like the UK and the Netherlands. But it's a pretty controversial topic, and I wonder about, I just be curious to get your opinions on the concept of when should we not rebuild?
I'll jump in here. You know, this has been a huge discussion in New Jersey, and as somebody who doesn't live, well, I do live in New Jersey now, but didn't live in New Jersey in the beginning, it felt strange to be going into communities and even to have thoughts of, wow, this is a ridiculous place to have a community. You guys shouldn't be living here. But you can't say that to people, and it's. You know, it's a tension that's gonna continue to exist for a long time. In some communities in South Jersey, they've already been doing buybacks and buying up properties to convert the land into natural habitat. But you know, there's bumper stickers down there that say "No retreat, save the Bayshore communities," and you know, when you think about the history of a community like that, how much those folks contributed to the birth of this country. One of the original Tea Party towns is a little place called Greenwich down in Cumberland County. You know, it's really hard to say this is not a community that's worth saving, even though. If you look at the numbers, it probably is going to be underwater in 100 years, unless we make some serious changes. And so I think, you know, rather than throwing up our hands and retreating, I think it is important to build connections to why these communities are under threat, why it's no longer sustainable for people to live there, and to try and create broad-based solutions that involve communities far beyond the ones that are most under threat themselves.
Yeah, I'd like to just jump in because oftentimes people, I mean, that's a dog whistle for let New Orleans drown, you know. But I think, you know, a couple of things I'd like to say about New Orleans is, part of the reason the flooding was so bad was the awful super highway to the city that the Army Corps of Engineers built, that giant boatway for industry out to the Gulf of Mexico that basically no one ever used. So, American taxpayers spent a lot of money building a really destructive avenue for water into the city. Much of the city is actually, above sea level. New Orleans is not a coastal city. If you look at a map, not yet. But the other thing I'd like to mention, and this is one of my favorite, articles as a scholar that I have students read, but the sort of public intellectual Mike Davis, I don't know if you know his work, he did a really great article about 20 years ago called The Case for Letting Malibu Burn. And it was about the fires in California. And what he did is he went through historically from the 1930s to 1995, and he looked at the amount of money spent to fight fires, the amount of deaths in fighting fires, just the whole nature and economy of the disaster of fires. And what he found is that the fires in downtown Los Angeles and the various slum buildings that were never retrofitted, even though the code said they had to be, killed 20 or 30 times as many people. Actually more than that, many times more people, and much less money spent than the fires along the coast and the multi-million-dollar homes of the movie stars and the very wealthy. So there's a way in which we look at disaster in which it's okay to call in the federal government and the helicopters and all of these various resources to fight the fires of a few homes sitting along the coast of Los Angeles, and the federal government foots the bill. But by gosh, in downtown LA, where you have these old apartment buildings with the giant corridor that runs down the center of them, which was basically an avenue for air, would be consumed by fires, with people literally throwing their children out of the window in order not to be consumed by fire. And you saw hundreds and hundreds of people die over the same period of time that 8 people died in these Malibu/wealthy home fires. So we have to think a little bit about equity when we think about, should we rebuild, should we attend to this disaster, and look at who gets this disaster money and who doesn't, and what's the equity inherent in that.
Yeah, you'll notice you hear people talking about managed retreat with respect to communities like poor communities. With respect to poor communities, they talk about managed retreat, but nobody's really, policymakers would never dare bring it up when talking about a place like Long Beach Island or wealthy beach communities. We're just throwing $150,000 grants so that people can elevate their homes and afford their flood insurance, where people in the poor communities on the Bay Shore, in Delaware Bay Shore, the Raritan Bay Shore, up along the Hackensack River, those are the places where they say, yeah, you guys shouldn't live here.
And just briefly, I would say that it's essential that when we build back, we do it in such a way that it is weather resilient. And I mean, that's what this is all about. That's what we're talking about. But we need to figure out how to make that happen more, and how to get people the resources to do what they need to do in order to have that design. I want to add the thing I didn't mention is NREL did a study of the 13 best built buildings in Greensburg, and they are achieving about $250,000 per year in energy savings for that community. And again, this is fewer than 1,000 people. That's success. That's success. And again, it's not success there by every measure, but that one's significant. And on the housing side, there were no mandates to build green, but of the 300 homes that were rebuilt, 150 families partook of the information that was offered by NREL and us and built better buildings. We studied those. Those 150 homes that use that information average 42% more energy efficient than code. So that's 42% savings on heating and cooling that's being recycled in that economically depressed community. That's success. That's important.
Okay, so let's give a round of applause to our panel.